Our topic this afternoon is funeral of the faithful, and I wanted to cover the funeral of Jacob, and because Jacob is a faithful believer, so our topic this afternoon is funeral of the faithful, and starting from Genesis 49, we read of Jacob's death, and I'm going to divide my talk this day into three parts. First, we're going to look at Jacob's last words, and then we are going to look at the mourning of Joseph and other people, and then we're going to look at the purpose of the funeral. Okay, so we're going to cover three topics this afternoon. So, Jacob's last words from verse 29. And he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Okay, my people. And then he went on to say, bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. In the cave. So that's verse 29. The last words of Jacob. Okay? And you'll recall that when we considered Genesis, in chapter 48, Jacob had already started to get Joseph to put his hand on his palm and to swear that he would bury him in Canaan and rather than Egypt. Now Jacob mentioned this again, not before Joseph, but before his other 11 sons, his 11 other sons. So why did he have to mention this again? Maybe for two reasons. One reason, I think is a minor reason, not a major reason, was to avoid dispute among the sons after his death. So he had 12 sons. Maybe some sons might say, well, Egypt is good, why don't you bury him in Egypt? And then Joseph would say, oh no, he charged me to do that. But the other sons might say, oh, well, we didn't hear that. So that may be to avoid disputes among the sons. I think that is, but I think such dispute would be unlikely because Joseph had already inherited the birthright. Okay, we mentioned it last time. He had already taken the birthright, so he had the right to deal with matters after the death of Jacob, and he was also the prime minister of Egypt, and so his brothers could not really dispute with him. But I think a more important reason is a spiritual reason. Jacob mentioned this again with the aim of helping his successors. Is to help with the spiritual life of his successors, is to give him spiritual lessons. So I think this is the most important reason. In verse 29 he mentioned, I am to be gathered unto my people. The meaning here is not that he is to be buried there because he wanted his dead body to be buried with his ancestors, with his father, with his grandfather. That's not the meaning here. In other parts of Genesis, we read that in Genesis, it has repeated a few times. Gathered to my people. Okay, this phrase has come up a few times in the book of Genesis. So the meaning here, the meaning is Jacob was telling his sons after he had gone what his wishes or his belief, okay, after he had gone. He surely believed. Jacob did not fear death, okay? He had no fear over death. He believed that he would be gathered to his people, so his father, his grandfather, and other faithful believers. So he believed that he would be together with them. So that was Jacob's faith. He's not like, oh, I'm dying, but he said, I will be gathered to my people. So that is a clear manifestation of faith. He's not saying, after my death, I will be with the entire world, I will be with the sinners, but he said, I will be gathered to my people, okay, to the other faithful believers. So this is a testimony of faith. So Jacob, like his ancestors, Isaac and Abraham, he's willing to forgo this world in exchange of a better home. Okay, he's saying, when I die, I will be with them, with Isaac and Abraham. So that is a testimony of faith. And then in verse 30 to verse 32, you might wonder why Jacob had to give a detailed account of his burying place. He could have just said, oh, I'll have to be buried with Isaac and Abraham, or Leah, Sarah. Why did he have to give so much details? Verse 30, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The purchase of the field and the cave, and of the cave that is therein, was from the children of Heth. Well, how come Jacob had to give so much detail? Is that because he worried that his sons would not know the location? For example, in Hong Kong, we are in lack of burying place. So sometimes we'll just put human ashes in a massive place. My grandmother was buried in Macau. I had never been to her burying place, but my mom took me there. Maybe my mom knew that she was approaching towards her last days, and she showed unto me the place, the location where my grandmother's ashes, human remains were put. But I think here, Jacob had to give so much detail, not because he feared that his sons would not know where the location would be. His sons believed, surely had been to that place. They had been in Canaan for so many years, and when Isaac, that is when Jacob's father died, the children, the sons were grown up already. In Genesis 35, Genesis chapter 35. Genesis 35, verse 28 and verse 29. Isaac died after Leah died. Okay. Leah died when giving birth, and Isaac only died after that. Verse 28, and the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people. So, gathered unto his people, okay. Being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So, Esau and Jacob. And at that time, Jacob's sons were grown up. So they had surely been to that place, the burying place. And then apart from Isaac, Leah was also buried there. Jacob said in verse 31, there they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. So I'm sure, the sons knew where the burying place was. Maybe Benjamin didn't know, maybe Joseph didn't know, but the first 3 sons, or the first 4 sons of Leah would know where the burying place would be. So, it's Jacob's last breath. He was about to die, and he had to speak so much, and he spoke so much for a reason, and it is a lesson of faith. Jacob, spiritual, he's a man of strength. Where this if you read Genesis 23, you know where that land comes from. That's from, that is when Abraham's wife Sarah died, and then there was no land. Abraham didn't know where to bury her body, and so he purchased a piece of land to bury Sarah. And the people of Canaan had a lot of respect for Abraham, saying that, we'll give you the land for free, but Abraham insisted to buy a piece of land. He insisted in a clear transaction, and that was also only a burying place, to bury Sarah. A more detailed account is in Genesis 23. You brought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. A possession, that is, Abraham in his whole life in Canaan, although God had promised him that the land of Canaan would be given to Abraham, it's promised to Abraham and his sons. But you remember that in the life of Abraham, the only piece of land that he had in the land of Canaan is the burying place, is the tiny burying place. In other words, when Abraham died, he still had not acquired what God had promised him. He could only see so that was the emphasis of Jacob. Abraham died in the faith, and he buried his wife in that land, in that piece of land. That is to show that he had faith. He believed that God would give him that land. When he died, he had only a possession of a tiny burying place, but he still believed that God would give him the land. And Isaac was also buried there. Why? Why not any other random places? Well, because this piece of land was the only piece of land that the family had acquired. So they died in faith, although they had not yet acquired what God promised them. And now Jacob is dying, but have they inherited the land of Canaan? No, not yet. So Jacob also told, through this lesson, he wanted to tell his sons that what faith is. Faith is believing in things which have not been materialized. You still believe that you will acquire it. So Jacob says he lives by faith in the promises of God. Jacob believed in the promises of God, and when he was dying, he still believed. So he wanted to encourage his sons, his successors, to continue to believe that they would ultimately return to the land of Canaan. Now this is faith. Well, brothers and sisters, we have a lot of things we have not yet acquired. For example, we still haven't acquired heaven. We're still living in this world. We're still suffering in this world. We're still facing a lot of difficulties in this world. But if you truly have faith, you will believe in God. You will believe that Jesus Christ shall return. You will believe that even when you are buried, one day you shall rise again, and you will be with Christ in heaven. You can enjoy the banquet of the Lamb of God. This is faith. Faith is something that you believe you will acquire the promises of God, even though you have not yet acquired it. God has also promised you that God will be with you, but do you believe that? In times of darkness and difficulties, do you still believe that God is with you and will see you through? Just like how a shepherd will take care of his sheep, do you believe that God will lead you and guide you? Or you're like Jacob, who seeks God's guidance all the time, everywhere. Now this is faith. Are you depending on yourself or depending on God? So Jacob is hoping that his future generations, his sons, will have the same faith. So he purposely asked that he be buried there. So it is a public testimony, an open testimony. He made his stance clear that his father's faith is also his faith. They all believed in the promises of God. And ultimately, yes, God gave them the land of Canaan. So we have to remind you that for a believer, like Jacob, not only that, in our life, when we are still living, we want to witness God, we want to glorify God, and we want to be of help to others. Even in your last breath, with your last breath, you still try to help others and to witness God, and you still desire to be useful in death. You still want your life after death to be a good testimony. And that is why in Christian churches, when our brothers and sisters die, we will hold funeral services or memorial services. It's because we want to fulfill the desires of the believers. That is to, through the life of this believer, we can give glory unto God, and we can witness God, and we can have an opportunity to share the gospel to some friends who may never visit churches, who may never attend churches. So we respect. So, the churches are willing to do such work or such services to honor the will and desire of believers who have passed. And then, now we read that Jacob has died and he's gathered to his people. And then in chapter 50, And Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. Some believers, they ask, why you Christian believers, you believe that, when one dies, when a believer dies, he will be in heaven, you believe in resurrection. Why would you still be mourning for the death of another believer? Is that because of lack of faith? Well, many get confused, or many misunderstood that. The Bible tells us that when Sarah died, Abraham mourned. When Jacob died, Joseph mourned for him. These are faithful believers, men of faith. They were not mourning over, whether Sarah or other believers would be saved by God or would be in heaven. So now we are going to try to understand the mourning of Christian believers. Well, we thank God that He has, that God's promises to Jacob, all of them were fulfilled. Do you remember the promise to Jacob in Bathsheba? God promised to him that Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. That is the promise of God. So that is to say, Joseph would be beside Jacob when he died. And that promise was fulfilled. When Jacob died, Joseph was beside him. And now, Joseph did exactly that. That is, he puts his hand on his eyes. So when Christian believers, we see, other Christian believers die and pass away, we, on the one hand, we give thanks and we are joyful because we know that this soul will be in heaven, will be reunited with God, will be gathered unto the people. So, like the Old Testament believers, we believe that one day we'll be with the Old Testament saints. But in the Old Testament, the New Testament time is the same. And when Abraham mourned for Sarah in Genesis chapter 23, he mourned for Sarah. And then here we read that Joseph also fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. Why? Because after all, we are human flesh. When our beloved one dies, when our loved ones die, we will miss them. We will miss him or her. Wow, he's so dear to us. Look at Joseph. He was apart from his father for 20 odd years, and 17 years ago, when his father came from Canaan, Joseph was overjoyed when he saw his father. And I believe that in the past 17 years, they had the most joyful time together because Joseph could see his father all the time, and the father was beside him, and they appreciated one another. Joseph and Jacob. Jacob was also Joseph's father and guide, good friend, and also not only his earthly father but also his spiritual father. So, when Joseph considered that he would no longer see his father again, he would surely miss him and he would surely be sorrowful. And so there's reason for his mourning, because he could no longer hear God's word from his father. He could no longer hear words of wisdom and teaching, words of truth from Jacob's mouth. He was delighted in hearing Jacob's words. He appreciated those words, and those words were of help to him. Now, there's no such advisor to him. And because of his father's death, he can no longer hear about, from his father about Isaac and Abraham. At that time there was no Bible. There's no book of Genesis. How could they know about, their grandfather or great-grandfather? When Joseph thought to himself, oh, now when I wanted to know more about my great-grandfather or grandfather, there's no such chance again. Just like when our parents pass away, if we want to know more about their past life, there's no such opportunity. It's just like when my grandfather passed away, we often said, we will go back to his birthplace to see what it's like. But there's no such opportunity now. Because, my grandfather came to Hong Kong from the mainland, and then he changed his name when he came over from mainland to Hong Kong. So we don't know what his original name was. And if I wanted to go back to check my genealogy, there is no such chance. I was told his original name, but I failed to write that down. So you see what I mean here. So Joseph here in the Bible, he considered that he's already cut off from the history. So he felt sad and he was mourning. And when he looked back at how his father loved him, he created, he made for him a colorful garment, and his mother passed away a long time ago, but his father loved him. So when he looked back to his childhood, his time with his father, and when he was in Egypt, when he was away from his father for 20 years, when he considered his sufferings in Egypt, and when he considered his interaction, his time with his father for the past 17 years, he's full of emotions. So when we mourn, how deep we mourn depends on how much we love the one who passed away. If we love that person much, we should also mourn much. So we need to understand this. Very often we fail to understand this. When we lose a companion, a friend, and a teacher, a mentor. Well, now Joseph is bearing all these. Yes, he's a man of faith, but we still mourn because he still missed his father. So we have to understand this. Do we have any other reasons to mourn when a believer dies? Apart from the fact that we miss him, we can no longer see him or her. Well, we can look at his brothers, okay? He had, his other brothers, the four that we have mentioned, and Reuben, Simeon, Levi, what did they feel? Maybe they are not as close to Jacob as Joseph was, but we believe that, when Jacob was dying and he was blessing his children, he talked about what Reuben did, Simeon, what Simeon and Levi did in chapter 49. I'm sure when Jacob left, his brethren were also sad. They were also mourning. because they looked back to their wrongdoing, to how they made their father suffer when the father was alive. When we fail to do what we ought to do, that is also a source of grief. When we have hurt our father, and when we want to compensate our wrongdoing, and we can no longer be given a chance to compensate for our wrongdoing, that is also a source of grief. The Chinese also say, that sometimes parents pass away before the children have a chance to repay the kindness and hard work in bringing them up. So they feel that they're indebted to their father. So that is also a possible source of grief. Okay? So what we need to learn is that when we as children, when our parents are still alive, we have to look after them, we have to help them. We should not wait until they die and then we mourn. Yes, it's still good to mourn, but it's a bit too late. We need to do good to our parents, especially if you're a believer, and when your parents are not believers, you especially have to do that. When they're still alive, we have to do our best in bringing the gospel to them. Why? Because one day, when they die, if we haven't, shared with them Jesus Christ, our Savior, I'm sure you will be regretting all your life. So you have to understand what mourning is about. We have to do our best, in doing what we ought to do. Not only our parents, but, people we love, our spouse, our children. We need to do what we ought to do. Otherwise, one day you will regret. In verse 2, and Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. Now, yes, they are mourning, but that didn't stop Joseph from carrying out his father's will or command. So yes, we have to mourn, we can mourn, but we still need to do what we ought to do. So Joseph here acted accordingly. He started to, take care of the body of Jacob, to bring it back to Canaan. And then he got the physicians, that is physicians of his home, that is his servants, to embalm his father. That, Egypt is famous for mummification of the dead. They are really good at it. When in museums you see the mummies, they are still kept intact because Egypt is famous for mummification of the dead. So if they are to transport the dead body from Egypt to Canaan, they have to embalm the body. So Joseph made use of this opportunity to handle the body of his father so that it would not decay. But why did he use physicians? Because we know that in Egypt, those dealing with dead bodies, why did they have to deal with dead bodies? If you look at history, the Egyptians, they do mummification, is in a sense is their religion, is a religious ritual. They worship idols. That is a view of death. When handling the dead body, very often the Egyptians, they would do it in the Egyptians' temples. It's only a speculation. Okay, it's possible that Joseph didn't want, or Joseph wanted to avoid the magical and mystical practices of the embalmers who were closely related to the Egyptian pagan religion. The physicians also knew how to deal with the dead body. So, that's one possible reason. Or physicians is only a general term. Some people have this interpretation. But anyway, here we read that he got the physicians to embalm his father in verse 3. And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Here, we need not discuss it in great length, but it seems that the 70 days is supported by the Egyptian test. Until we only got a clear understanding of the Egyptian test until recently. The Egyptian test recorded that 70 days is between the time of death and the completion of the burial process. How many days were needed to deal with the dead body? Some say 16 days, some say 66 days. So here 40 days. There were different ways of dealing with the dead body. For the poor, they may deal with the dead body with simple processes. So, the dead body is not preserved so well. But for the kings and the rich, it might take a longer time to process the dead body. Okay? And then in verse 4, and when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Lo, I die in my grave, which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan. There shalt thou bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. So now Joseph has prepared the body. He's ready to go to Canaan. And of course he has to get approval from Pharaoh because he's the prime minister. And so he had to get the approval of Pharaoh in order to take leave. But some people wonder why he didn't speak to Pharaoh directly. Why he spake unto the house of Pharaoh instead. He said, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, why did he seek consent from Pharaoh so indirectly? Some people say, maybe Joseph was losing his power. I don't believe that's the reason, because from the text later on in this chapter, we read that Pharaoh still respects him a lot. Maybe because he is mourning. Maybe there were rules in the palace that those who were mourning could not enter the palace. So that could be a reason. Or maybe Joseph was in his mourning dress, he's unshaven and unwashed, and so maybe it's considered unsuitable that he meet Pharaoh directly. So he didn't approach Pharaoh directly. And, his reasons were clear. He said, in verse 5, My father made me swear, saying, Lo, I die in my grave, which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan. There shalt thou bury me. Now Joseph is a man of wisdom. He didn't want to offend Pharaoh, because from Pharaoh's perspective, now, your whole family came to Egypt, because of the famine that you were facing. I gave you hospitality, I gave you food, but now when your father died, you wanted to go back to Canaan. So is Egypt not good enough? You wanted to go back to Canaan? Why was he not buried in Egypt? So Joseph made it very clear, and it's also a testimony of their faith. He said, my father made me swear. My father demanded that. My father commanded me to do that. Saying, lo, I die in my grave which I have digged for me. So his father had made plans already. So I had to respect my father. And my father had this faith, this belief. So, he articulated very well. He made Pharaoh understand that that is what he had to do. And Pharaoh, of course, gave his consent in verse 6. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury thy father according as he made thee swear. So it's clear that Pharaoh consented. Not only that Pharaoh consented, Pharaoh actually, as you read on, you will read that Pharaoh made great effort in helping Joseph bury his father. Now let's look at the purpose of the funeral. First, we read that the funeral is extravagant in verse 7 to verse 9. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the house of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds, they lived in the land of Goshen, and there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. In other words, not only, it's only a funeral. This funeral was splendid. It's almost like a royal funeral, or a national funeral. Pharaoh sent forth a lot of chariots and horsemen to accompany Jacob. Well, in Jacob's life, he had never had such splendid moments. Jacob worked for Laban, and then he's always, in the land of Canaan, he's an ordinary man. But the Bible also didn't mention that Joseph or Jacob desired such an extravagant funeral. That was not what they requested or required. So we are sure that it was Pharaoh who made such arrangement. Only Pharaoh could mobilize, his servants and the elders of Egypt to do this. Pharaoh would have, because it's Pharaoh who could not leave his country, so he mobilized other people to send off Jacob. And that is the grace of God upon Jacob. It's because Jacob honored God, Joseph honored God, and so God honored them in the eyes of Pharaoh. And it's because of Joseph that the entire nation and Pharaoh also endeared him and his father. It's not that our Christian funeral has to be like the funeral of Jacob. Has to be extravagant and costly. The main participants were his family members. I wanted to mention it in passing that in the Chinese Union version of the Bible, of the translation, in verse 9, here we read that in verse 8. And all the house of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds. So in the Chinese Union version, we read the women. The women man and the little ones. So the little ones and the flocks and the herds, they lived in the land of Goshen. Maybe the author of or the translator of the Chinese Union Version felt that, when the children are left in Goshen, so the moms, the ladies were also left in Goshen. But I think that can be crossed out. If you say all the women were left in Goshen, that means no women participated in the funeral of Jacob. The young ladies, the ladies without children, they could attend the funeral. So the Chinese Union Version has this issue here. So in other words, the meaning is that all that could go to the funeral, the entire family of Jacob, they all attended the funeral. And that is an important part here. In verse 10, we read about the funeral. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan. And there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. So you read, that their emotions were genuine. And that also shocked the Canaanites in verse 11. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning of the floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians." Wherefore the name of it was called Abel-Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. So this morning we read, caused the name of the place to change. So it's a history. It remains in history. So God allowed this arrangement for certain reasons, not only to waste money. God honored Jacob, but all that happened to Jacob, it didn't affect Jacob. Jacob had already left the world. He had already passed. So, for example, in Buddhism or in Taoism or in the Catholic churches, they believe that what you do in the funeral would help the one who has passed away. But the Christian churches don't believe in that. It's not important what people do for you after you die. The most important thing is that when you die, your soul is committed to God, and one day you will live again. So this is the hope of Christian believers. Everything ends when we leave the world, when we pass away. And there is nothing that we can do to change our spiritual status. That is clear in the teaching of Lazarus. So, all these were done for people around him. So let's look at the purpose of the funeral. What's the purpose of this funeral? What goals did it achieve? So first, to Joseph, when so many elders of the Egyptians, when there was a great company to mourn for Jacob, so to Joseph, that was very soothing. He saw that his father was respected. To him is a comfort. The Bible teaches us that we have to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. So as a Christian believer, we need to have sympathy to those who are weeping. We need to care about them, and we need to weep with them. We have to support them. When Jesus Christ saw Lazarus, you remember when he died, when he visited the home of Mary and Martha, when there were people mourning, we read that Jesus wept. He wept not because he thought that he had no hope, etc., but it's because he was sympathizing with those who were mourning. His heart, Jesus' heart, was with them. He was weeping with those who weep. So this is the attitude that we should have. If we know of somebody leaving, amongst in our church who have left or have passed away, we need to weep with those who weep. Too, the family is a sign of support and comfort. And when a great crowd, made their way from Egypt to the land of Canaan, it's a long journey. They journeyed a long time. So what would their conversation be? Would they talk about Jacob? They were attending the funeral of Jacob. They might be talking about Jacob and his life, and Joseph and his life, and the God they believed in. So to the Egyptians, it may be a great help because they could see from the life of Jacob and the work of Joseph, they could see that their religion was from the living God. They had to be buried in the land of Canaan. They believed in the promises of God. They had nothing in the land of Canaan, but they still determined to return to the land of Canaan. So it's a testimony. It's a testimony of faith. They hope that their God, Jesus Christ, or their God, the God of Israel, was a living God, and was a true religion. And then the third purpose is that for any funeral, to the attendees, it's beneficial to the attendees because it caused them to pause in the midst of a busy life and to reflect about their life. We are too busy. We rarely have time to consider where our life is heading to. Attending a funeral, a benefit of the funeral is to help us to reflect on our life, because we are forced to consider, the life of the one who has recently passed away. What message does it send to us? The message is that we have to consider our own life more seriously. One day, in the I'm sure the Chinese are familiar with this saying in a Catholic cemetery in Happy Valley. If translated to English, it reads, "I was one what you are, and let me try. Today I die and I'm dead and was buried in my birthplace, but you will be the same someday." Or it can be translated as, "What I once was and what I am now, you will become one." So one day we'll be like Jacob. We will be buried as well. But what do we? Where does our hope come from? We will all die. Only Jesus Christ can give us hope. Only the salvation of Christ can lead us to have triumph over the fear of death and grave. In Revelation, chapter 14, verse 13, it says, "Blessed are the dead who died in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works follow them." So this is the promise of the Bible. Those who died in Christ, in the Lord, they are blessed, because they may rest from their labors. They no longer need to labor in the world. Their tears, the physical weaknesses of their bodies, and their works will follow them. They will not be wiped away. You will not labor in vain. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 14, Paul says, "For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus." We have a living hope, an eternal hope. That is, if we believe in Jesus Christ, God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. So we will rise again, just like how Jesus rose again. So we have this hope as a believer. We hope that in a funeral, we can share the same hope. I'm sure Jacob had this hope, and Joseph had the same hope. Our hope is even clearer this time, because Jesus Christ had already died for us. But they, Jacob and Joseph, they had the same hope. They hoped that they would be gathered in the people, they would be gathered with the faithful believers. So may God help us. So we covered the funeral of Jacob today, this afternoon, and we are reminded that of the purposes of funeral and the attitude that we ought to have when attending funeral. So may God help us. Let's pray together. Lord, we give thanks to you. You have given us your word. May you help those who are mourning, when you comfort the family members of those who recently passed away. Lord, help us not to fear death, and help us not to fear where we'll be heading to after we pass away, because we are like Jacob. We can die with faith, and we can also be a testimony for you when we are alive and when after we are gone.